Okay, picture this scenario. And chances are you've probably been in this exact room, or maybe you are the leader trying to manage it. It's the annual leadership team budget review.
Hmm.
The atmosphere is quiet, maybe a little too quiet, but every single piece of data on that slide deck feels, well, loaded with explosive potential.
Right. The air is thick, isn't it? Not just with tension, but with real conviction. You've got marketing over here arguing passionately for a massive game-changing campaign. They want to drive brand growth. They need capital, like now, to hit some pretty aggressive revenue targets.
Yeah, and across the table, you see operations digging in. Their whole presentation insists that the core priority has to be optimization. Eliminating waste, cutting costs, maintaining those crucial reserves. They're metrics. They depend on ruthless efficiency.
And then, just when you think it's a two-way fight, the IT director drops the bomb.
Yeah.
They aren't even asking for growth money. They're demanding critical funds for infrastructure upgrades.
Oh, yes, Sam.
Exactly. To prevent what they're calling catastrophic future disruptions, things like major security vulnerabilities, system downtime risk. So what started out as, an exercise in collaborative priority setting, it just devolves. It turns into this sharp, almost defensive fight over a finite pool of cash.
And that, right there, that's the paradox we're really diving into today. Conflict like this. It usually gets branded as a symptom of a dysfunctional team, right? A failure of leadership, maybe?
That's the common view.
But our deep dive into these sources, it suggests something fundamentally different. When you have highly talented people clashing over priorities, it's often not dysfunction at all. It's actually a sign they deeply care. They care about the direction and the outcome for the organization.
That's a crucial reframe. The challenge, then, isn't really to eliminate that budget fight. I mean, doing that might just eliminate engagement altogether.
Good point.
So the mission for us today, in this deep dive, is to reframe conflict entirely, to look at how we can transform that raw, passionate disagreement into a high-leverage opportunity for collaboration, for innovation even. We're focusing on how effective leaders actually guide those intense debates toward productive, often superior solutions.
Okay, so before we get into solutions, let's unpack the battlefield a bit. Conflict isn't just one thing, is it? It takes several distinct forms, especially in leadership teams. And the sources break this down into, it looks like, 3 primary categories that help us diagnose where the heat is actually coming from.
Precisely. Knowing the type is key. The first one, and honestly, often the most distracting, is interpersonal conflicts.
Ah, the personality clashes.
Exactly. These are driven by personality differences, maybe clashing communication styles, or sometimes just ingrained personal opinions. This is the classic, I just can't stand how aggressive they are in meetings kind of dynamic. It doesn't even matter what the topic is.
It's about how they interact, not what they're saying.
Right. It's the manner, not the content. Then we move up a level to intergroup conflicts. This is when the conflict is happening within a single team. So maybe the operations leadership group is struggling internally to align on which optimization method is actually better. The fight is contained within that one department's boundaries. They're arguing over their own strategy.
Okay, internal team struggles. Got it.
And finally, the type we see playing out in our budget scenario, intergroup conflicts. This involves disputes between separate teams or departments. It's marketing versus IT versus operations, 3 distinct units all operating with different goals, different success metrics, pulling against each other for the same slice of that budget pie.
And what makes this so tricky to manage, especially at the leadership level, is just the sheer difference in how the conflict is perceived, isn't it? That aggressive defense of the IT budget we talked about, the IT director might genuinely see that as, passionate risk mitigation.
Absolutely. While the marketing head across the table perceives it as a hostile, uncompromising exchange, and this huge gap in perception, it really underscores a fundamental requirement for any leader navigating this. You have to cultivate the emotional intelligence needed to accurately diagnose what's really going on.
Because how you see the fight dictates your response.
Exactly. How you perceive it dictates whether you try to shut it down and potentially lose out on valuable innovation, or whether you find a way to constructively leverage it, which could lead to real growth.
That sets us up perfectly. We need to know what we're dealing with, what kind of fight it is, before we can start trying to manage it productively. So let's move into section 1 and take a closer look at the 3 common recurring sources that actually trigger these intense organizational discussions.
Yeah, recognizing these triggers is absolutely the foundational first step. If you can identify why the tension is happening, the root cause, not just the surface-level argument, then you can start to develop a targeted, effective resolution strategy. one that addresses the core issue rather than just, putting a lid on the noise.
Okay, the first major source, and this is really the structural driver behind our budget scenario example, is divergent goals and priorities.
This feels almost inevitable in any complex organization, right? I mean, every department kind of exists to maximize a specific metric. Marketing, they're judged on brand equity, lead volume.
Yes.
Operations, all about cost efficiency, delivery speed. IT, they need security, system uptime.
Exactly. And when resources are finite, which they always are,
Always.
these different success metrics don't just create a little tension. They pretty much force a competition for survival, or at least for resources. It creates this structural friction that's almost independent of the personalities involved. So the goals themselves, shaped by these distinct departmental missions, they just naturally create friction over who gets what piece of the pie.
Precisely. Let's look back at our case study. Marketing is pushing hard for those aggressive campaigns because their main KPI is aggressive revenue growth. They're literally incentivized to spend money to make money.
Right. While the operations head, their incentives are probably tied to cost control, maybe maintaining reserves for rainy days. Their KPIs are often rooted in risk management, lean processes. They're incentivized to save money.
So you see, their clash isn't necessarily personal. They could actually like each other. But professionally, they're pushing in opposite directions because they're both doing their jobs, pursuing their department's goals perfectly. But without a clear shared overarching objective that somehow ranks or integrates these department goals, what we call a superordinate goal, that budget discussion very quickly generates into a zero-sum game. Each leader feels, quite rightly, compelled to maximize their own department's position, sometimes even at the expense of another functional area.
Okay, that makes sense. The structure itself creates the conflict. Now that leads us nicely into the second major source, which the research suggests is maybe the most frequent day-to-day trigger: communication breakdown.
Ah, yes. This one is often the silent killer.
Why silent?
Because it often involves small, incremental lapses that just accumulate over time. Things like ambiguities in messages, unclear expectations about who's doing what by when, maybe irregular or overly informal updates.
Yeah.
These things breed massive misunderstandings, and then, under pressure, they erupt into full-blown conflict. Even a seemingly small lapse, like not documenting a decision properly, can have these huge ripple effects.
I can totally see this. Let's apply it to our operations team again. Imagine the operations director is communicating about a major efficiency project. They mention the timeline during an informal chat, maybe a quick working session. It's not recorded.
Right, happens all the time.
And then they move on. No formal minutes, no confirming email. Meanwhile, someone in finance who wasn't in that chat is still working towards the timeline that was outlined in last quarter's official documentation.
Exactly. And that misalignment, caused purely by that ambiguity and relying on informal channels, it doesn't just delay things. It leads to massive frustration down the line when the two teams suddenly realize they've been working towards completely different targets.
And the conflict then bubbles up as frustration with the other person.
Right, when the real root cause was just inconsistent communication channels.
So the actionable tip here isn't just, hey, communicate more. It sounds like it's more about standardizing how we communicate and ensuring there's some rigor to it.
Absolutely. The research really points towards formalizing the channels for important information flow. Things like documented updates, clear ownership assigned to decisions, regular structured feedback sessions, and scheduled check-ins where expectations are explicitly reiterated. We have to prevent those, informal hallway assumptions from completely derailing projects that depend on crystal clear cross-functional understanding.
Okay, communication discipline. Got it. Now, our third source touches on perhaps the most difficult element to manage: personal differences. This is where things like fundamental approach, leadership style, even temperament start to clash.
Yeah, this one is highly significant, especially when the leadership team is facing a really high-stakes decision like our constrained budget example. And we aren't just talking about simple personality conflicts like, I don't like coffee, I do. We're talking about fundamental differences in how people process risk, how they gather information, how they prefer to make decisions.
Okay, let's put two distinct styles back in our budget meeting. You might have the marketing head, who operates with a really decisive style. They prioritize quick, high-momentum decisions to capture market opportunities. They might see exhaustive analysis as analysis paralysis.
Okay, got that profile. Now let's clash that person with, say, the IT director, who operates with a very methodical, analytical style. They require comprehensive data, risk matrices, full spectrum evaluation before they'll commit to any action, especially if it involves systems risk. To them, speed might look like recklessness.
And here's the really interesting insight. Both of those approaches have inherent merit, don't they? The marketing head might actually secure a crucial first mover advantage.
Yeah.
The IT head might prevent a security catastrophe that saves the company millions.
Exactly. The friction comes almost entirely from the lack of understanding or maybe a lack of willingness to compromise between the two styles. This leads to misattribution of motives. The analytical person thinks the decisive one is reckless. The decisive one thinks the analyst is just a roadblock, deliberately slowing things down.
So the goal for the leader caught in the middle isn't necessarily to try and change the person's fundamental style.
Probably not realistic, no. The focus should be on changing the dynamic between them. The sources suggest encouraging really open, non-judgmental discussions about working styles, literally putting the styles on the table as a topic of conversation.
So using things like personality assessments or style frameworks like DISC or Myers-Briggs isn't just some HR compliance exercise. It's actually a strategic tool for conflict management.
It absolutely is. It's a critical strategic tool in this context. It allows the leadership team to actually name the friction points without blame, to acknowledge, okay, this person processes market opportunity very differently than I process systems risk, and that difference isn't a flaw in either of us. It's potentially a necessary counterweight to my own biases. That kind of adaptation, that understanding, is crucial.
Okay, so recognizing the specific trigger, is it divergent goals, communication gaps, or personal style friction? That's step one. Once we have a better idea of what's causing the conflict, we can move into section two. Why resolving it constructively is so incredibly vital. It's not about stopping the argument. It's about harnessing that energy to achieve, hopefully, breakthrough results.
Right. Conflict resolution, when you approach it with a real commitment to depth and fairness, it goes way beyond just diffusing tension. It becomes a cornerstone for building stronger, more resilient teams, improving the actual caliber of decisions, and fundamentally fostering a leadership environment based on psychological safety.
Let's start with that first major benefit, which still feels a bit counterintuitive to me, enhancing collaboration and trust. How does arguing, even productively, actually increase trust?
It works through the mechanism of psychological safety. When leaders handle disagreements constructively, and by that I mean they ensure the conversation stays focused on the task or the issue, not the person, they send a really powerful signal to the entire team.
What's the signal?
The signal is, every perspective here is valued. And crucially, you'll not be penalized or ridiculed for bringing up a difficult, dissenting, or maybe even an unpopular viewpoint.
So you're creating the mental space for people to take intellectual risks without fearing personal reprisal later on.
Precisely. Let's circle back to our IT and marketing heads fighting over those resources. If the leader just shuts down the argument, maybe imposes a decision from above without truly hearing the deeper concerns driving each side, well, trust erodes quickly.
Yeah, people feel unheard.
But if that leader proactively facilitates a dialogue, maybe ensures both sides feel their core concerns have been genuinely acknowledged, perhaps even summarized back to them to confirm understanding, that's when trust gets built.
So that act of transparency, that rigorous acknowledgement of the other party's perspective, their risks, their pressures, that's the key mechanism.
It really is. It deepens professional relationships because it proves the system, the process, is fair. And as that trust deepens, the willingness of team members to share truly innovative, maybe even slightly radical ideas increases significantly. They become more likely to take calculated risks on new initiatives because they trust that if they make a mistake, it won't be, weaponized against them in the next conflict.
And that fosters a measurable culture of creativity and growth.
Exactly. Trust becomes the engine that actually translates that conflict energy, which can feel negative, into positive organizational momentum.
Okay, trust is huge. Let's look at benefit B, encouraging diverse perspectives.
This one's pretty fundamental. Conflict, by its very definition, involves differing viewpoints. And those differences, those diverse perspectives, are inherently the seeds of creativity and innovation. A truly skilled leader doesn't just tolerate difference. They actively seek it out and harness it.
Okay, take us through the product brainstorming session anecdote again. Marketing, they're citing customer surveys. They want this flashy, maybe high-cost feature set. Development, meanwhile, is focused on technical debt, scalability. They insist on a minimalist, stable product first.
Right. That discord, if you just let it fester, it leads to resentment, maybe passive resistance.
Yeah.
But the skilled leader, they reframe that discord as a necessary, even healthy tension. They don't push for immediate agreement. Instead, they treat that clash as an opportunity to explore all the angles that a single unified perspective would inevitably miss.
So the leader essentially says, we are not choosing feature set A or feature set B right now.
Exactly. They might say something like, we are using the created tension between these two valid perspectives to design feature set C, something better than either A or B alone.
Okay, but how do they actually force that integration? That feels like the hard part.
It is. It requires structure. The leader might mandate specific constraints. For example, okay team, 50% of the final product specs must directly address marketing's feedback on customer excitement and market differentiation. But the other 50% must strictly adhere to development's non-negotiable technical resource constraints for the first quarter. By forcing that integration, by setting those constraints, they inspire genuinely out-of-the-box solutions that have to satisfy the core requirements of both initially warring factions.
So the outcome isn't just a watered-down compromise.
Hopefully not. Ideally, it's a superior, richer, hybrid solution, one that accounts for both technical feasibility and aggressive market demand. It becomes an intellectual synthesis, not just splitting the difference.
You convert that potential friction into fuel for progress. You demonstrate that the organization's strength lies not in an easy agreement, but in the rigorous defense and ultimately the integration of different valid perspectives.
Precisely. You show the difference is an asset.
Okay, and finally, benefit C, improving decision-making. How does healthy debate actually elevate the quality and the long-term stickiness of our decisions?
Well, constructive conflict inherently enforces a more rigorous examination of every idea put on the table. When a team feels psychologically safe enough to, say, challenge the CEO's core assumption or to question the established way we've always done it, that team is compelled to scrutinize options much more deeply. They consider multiple perspectives before a decision gets locked in. It's basically the antidote to groupthink.
We hear about that all the time, decisions failing because nobody dared to point out the obvious flaw, especially when the stakes are high or the leader has a strong opinion.
Exactly. In those high-stakes strategy meetings, if the debate over two competing approaches, let's call them option X, the aggressive growth path, versus option Y, the measured stability path, if that debate is respectful but also really thorough, the team will almost certainly uncover risks and opportunities hidden within both paths, things that were maybe invisible to the initial proponents of each isolated option.
And this often results in, again, a superior hybrid solution, doesn't it? Maybe they take the market capture speed from option X, but temper it with the crucial regulatory compliance checks embedded in option Y.
That's often the outcome. And here's the powerful organizational payoff. Because everyone participated in that rigorous debate, they feel a sense of ownership over the final result. If the decision is just handed down from on high, people might comply, sure. But if the decision emerges from intense, fair, transparent deliberation, everyone involved is far more committed to making that chosen course of action succeed, even if their initial preference was ultimately overruled.
Ownership drives commitment, not just compliance.
Exactly. Sustained commitment.
This brings us directly to the how. We get the benefits now, but leaders need a tactical framework. They need tools. So let's transition into section 3 and focus on the essential strategies for actually reframing conflict effectively in the moment.
Okay, the first strategy, and you could argue it's the most crucial one, is creating a safe environment for expression. Now, this isn't just some, touchy-feely HR concept. It is the fundamental infrastructure requirement for any constructive conflict. If team members fear negative repercussions being embarrassed, penalized, sidelined, and panicked, they will simply self-censor. And when they do that, the organization loses access to its most critical, often ground-level information.
Right, but how do we move beyond just saying this is a safe space, especially when tensions are already running high, like in that budget meeting scenario? It can feel a bit hollow sometimes.
That's a fair point. You have to actively set the stage by establishing clear, non-negotiable ground rules for the discussion before it gets heated, or right at the start if it already is. These rules need to be simple but enforced rigorously by the leader. Things like mandatory active listening, really listening to understand, not just to rebut, equal speaking time. Perhaps using a timer, if needed, in really contentious situations. And maybe what we could call the no veto rule, meaning you can't just use your positional authority, your title, to instantly shut down a technical concern raised by someone more junior or from another department. That structure imposes order on what can feel like emotional chaos.
This is where we can bring in some of that theoretical backing we found. Our research mentioned the Carnegie perspective, which basically notes that conflict is actually inherent in collaborative decision-making. It's unavoidable whenever you're trying to reconcile multiple legitimate preferences and goals, like different department targets.
And that's the core insight leaders really need to internalize. If conflict is inherent, if it's literally baked into the system simply by virtue of having specialized departments with different goals, then the leader's job shifts dramatically, doesn't it? It's no longer about conflict elimination. That's impossible. It becomes about conflict design. How do we structure the organization, the teams, the meeting dynamics to ensure that the friction that inevitably occurs is healthy and productive friction, not toxic, destructive friction? As Simon Sinek often points out, the best teams thrive on trust, even when they're in profound disagreement.
So lesson #1 here is really about the leader's crucial opening move. Acknowledge the conflict and immediately reframe it.
Yes, the leader has to step in the moment the temperature starts rising. They need to explicitly validate the passion people are showing, but then pivot the focus back to the shared purpose. They might say something like, okay, I can hear how aggressively IT is defending system uptime, and I absolutely hear how passionately marketing is defending our market share. That tells me everyone in this room is fighting hard for the success of this company.
Okay, validate the passion first.
Now, let's take that passion, acknowledge it, maybe put it aside just for a moment, and focus together on solving the shared puzzle. How do we best mitigate the greatest immediate risk while also enabling maximum possible growth within our constraints? See how that immediately tries to turn the fight from a competition between departments into a shared analytical exercise?
Yeah, it shifts the frame from me versus you to us versus the problem. Okay, strategy 2 deals with a common mistake leaders make, encouraging feedback and clarification. The mistake being jumping too quickly into solution mode.
Oh, absolutely. Leaders often feel pressure to find the quick fix, put a Band-Aid on the problem and move on. But solving too quickly usually means the underlying concerns, the root causes, are often ignored or glossed over, which basically guarantees the conflict will just recur later, probably worse.
Right.
This is precisely why Stephen Covey's advice from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is like the golden rule for leadership and conflict. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. It's famous for a reason.
And this isn't just passively letting someone talk. It requires real intellectual rigor, doesn't it? Actively listening not just for the surface requests, like the budget line item, but for the fundamental risk or opportunity that's driving that request.
Exactly. We need analytical tools for this. A great one is the 5 whys technique. Let's quickly apply it to our budget scenario again. Marketing asks for $10 million for a big campaign. That's the symptom.
Okay. Why?
Why? Okay, they say to generate 5,000 qualified leads.
Why 5,000 leads?
Why do we need 5,000 leads? Because our Q2 revenue projections are looking worryingly soft. That's a deeper symptom.
Why are projections soft?
Why are they soft? Because competitor X just launched a disruptive new feature that's seriously threatening our core market share. Aha, now we're getting to a potential root cause, an external competitive threat.
Okay, now do IT's request? They need $3 million for new routers. Symptom.
Right. Why? Because the current gear is running at 95% capacity.
Yeah.
Okay, deeper symptom.
Why is 95% a problem?
Why is 95% capacity a problem? Because it's creating unacceptable latency for users and, more importantly, poses a real risk of system downtime. Still describing the problem.
Okay, and why is downtime unacceptable right now?
Why is downtime unacceptable?
Yeah.
Because our European operations have to meet extremely stringent GDPR compliance reporting requirements. Even 12 hours of unexpected downtime could put us in breach, risking massive regulatory fines. Bingo. Root cause number 2, a significant regulatory and financial risk.
Wow. Okay, just by asking why a few times, you completely shifted the conversation. It went from marketing needs money and IT needs equipment to we as a company face a 2-pronged strategic challenge. An immediate competitive threat eroding market share and an imminent regulatory risk with potentially huge financial penalties. Those are entirely different conversations to have.
Aren't they just? By actively listening and applying a simple root cause analysis technique like the 5 whys, you're doing more than just gathering information. You're showing profound respect for the person's position because you're taking the time to truly validate the why behind their request, not just the what. And that respect, that's the ultimate foundation for building trust, especially when resources are tight.
So lesson #2 is crystal clear. You absolutely must create structured space for everyone involved to be fully heard and for their underlying issues to be analyzed before a single solution is even proposed. No jumping to conclusions.
No jumping. Understand first.
All right, strategy 3 addresses what happens after all that analysis and understanding, practicing transparency in decision making. Because, let's face it, not everyone is going to get exactly what they wanted in a zero-sum budget fight. So how do you maintain trust when you have to deliver potentially tough news?
Transparency becomes the critical trust mechanism when difficult trade-offs are required. The leader absolutely has to explain the explicit reasoning behind the final decision. And crucially, they need to show how that decision aligns with the superordinate goal or the priorities that were hopefully established during that analysis phase. The process, the criteria used for the decision, must be visible and clear to everyone.
Okay, let's follow through on our budget case study example. Let's say the leader, after that 5 whys analysis, decided that the most immediate unmitigated financial risk was the IT director's regulatory concern about GDPR fines.
Okay, a plausible outcome. So the decision communicated might be something like,
Yeah.
based on our analysis of immediate financial risk, we've decided to immediately allocate the full $3 million required to upgrade the critical routers and switches. This action directly addresses the pressing regulatory and operational risk we identified.
So IT gets their funding. What about marketing?
However, the leader continues, to balance this necessary risk mitigation with our critical growth objectives, we are allocating partial funds, say $2 million, to marketing immediately. This will allow for a smaller, highly targeted campaign in Q1, and we are formally documenting a commitment to revisit the full campaign request in the Q2 budget cycle, conditioned on achieving specific, agreed-upon early efficiency gains from the operations team's new initiatives.
Okay, so it's a phased approach with clear conditions, and the transparency comes in explaining the rationale, the decision criteria used.
Precisely. The leader needs to communicate clearly. This decision was based on a structured risk assessment framework that prioritized preventing a potential, let's say, $5 million regulatory fine over acquiring an estimated $6 million in new market share, specifically in Q1. We are consciously mitigating the largest financial certainty first, while still maintaining some momentum towards our growth objective. This isn't about favoring IT or operations. It's based on an agreed-upon scale of risk and priority for the overall health of the organization.
Got it. Lesson #3. Communicate tough decisions with absolute clarity and integrity. Make sure the reasoning is crystal clear, especially when you have to tell a team no, or at least not right now.
Clarity and rationale are key.
Okay, our final strategy in this section is really the leader's elevation tool. Strategy number 4, focusing on common goals.
Yes. Conflicts tend to become toxic and entrenched when the participants dig into defending their individual departmental fortresses. My budget, my team, my priorities. The leader's most important ongoing job in a conflict situation is to continuously elevate the conversation back to the ultimate shared mission. What are we all trying to achieve together as one unified entity?
This sounds like deliberately designing and constantly referencing that superordinate goal we mentioned earlier, a goal so compelling and large that it obviously requires interdepartmental cooperation to have any chance of success.
Absolutely. The conversation must be actively shifted away from my department's need versus your department's need, and towards how do we collectively achieve our most critical external success. The leader needs to consciously interject to change the focus when things get bogged down in departmental weeds.
So in that budget meeting, the intervention might sound something like,
It might be. Okay, team, we've heard the detailed risks from IT, and we've heard the significant market opportunities for marketing. Thank you for that clarity. Now let's remind ourselves and agree that our primary collective mission for this quarter is achieving sustainable, risk-mitigated growth. With that lens, let's reprioritize the proposed projects based on which ones will move the needle most significantly on that shared metric, regardless of which department initially proposed them.
that really reframes the entire competitive landscape internally, doesn't it? Suddenly, operations, marketing, and IT are no longer competing primarily against each other for slices of the budget pie. They're collaborating externally, using the budget as a tool to achieve that shared goal of sustainable, risk-mitigated growth.
Exactly. It changes the whole dynamic. When done consistently, it starts to institutionalize collaboration over internal competition. The leadership team begins to view resources not as mine or yours, but as corporate assets that have to be strategically deployed to achieve the shared ultimate objective we all signed up for.
So lesson #4, shift the conversation, constantly and deliberately, away from individual or departmental interests and towards those shared overarching goals. Keep bringing it back up.
Keep bringing it back. That's the leader's job.
Okay, those four strategies, creating safety, seeking understanding, being transparent, and focusing on common goals, provide a really solid framework. But we know effective resolution is never truly one size fits all. People are different. So in Section 4, we need to dig into tailoring our approaches based on individual behavior and, critically, building the core competency that makes all of this possible: advanced emotional intelligence.
Right, we touched briefly on the idea of different working styles earlier, but when conflict actually erupts, we tend to see specific, predictable behavioral patterns emerge. So the first key to tailoring your resolution approach effectively is identifying and tailoring conflict styles. We can lean heavily here on established frameworks, like the Thomas Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument, or TKI, which identifies 5 common styles based on how assertive versus how cooperative someone tends to be in conflict situations.
Okay, let's go a bit deeper than just listing them. Can you give us a quick behavioral snapshot of each of the 5 styles so listeners can maybe start recognizing them in their own teams or even in themselves?
Sure, let's break them down. 1, first you have competing. These folks score high on assertiveness, but low on cooperativeness. They prioritize their own concerns, their own agenda, above pretty much everything else. They're going to be decisive. They argue strongly, maybe using facts, logic, or even power to get their way. They often view conflict as a win-lose situation, and they intend to win.
Okay, the my way or the highway type.
Sometimes, yeah. Second, accommodating. This is the opposite profile. Low assertiveness, high cooperativeness. These individuals really seek to smooth things over, maintain harmony. They might neglect their own needs or downplay their own points of view just to satisfy others and keep the peace. For them, the relationship often trumps the task outcome.
The peacekeeper. Got it.
Third, avoiding. This is low assertiveness and low cooperativeness. These individuals simply try to postpone, ignore, or completely sidestep the conflict. They might withdraw from the situation, hoping it goes away. This could be because they believe the conflict is hopeless, maybe they feel powerless, or they really fear damaging the relationship if they engage.
Okay, avoids confrontation at all costs.
Pretty much. Fourth is compromising. This style is moderate on both assertiveness and cooperativeness. They look for the middle ground, the expedient solution. They're willing to sacrifice some of their position, but they usually insist the other side do the same. This is often the quickest path to a resolution, but sometimes it results in a suboptimal outcome for everyone you know. The classic, splitting the baby.
Right, quick, but maybe not the best.
And finally, fifth, you have collaborating. This is the ideal, though often the most time-consuming style. High assertiveness and high cooperativeness. These individuals aren't satisfied until they find a solution that fully satisfies the core concerns of both parties. They work with the other party, digging deep to reframe the conflict as a shared problem-solving exercise. They aim for a true win-win.
Okay, that detailed breakdown really eliminates where the friction can come from just based on style alone. Now let's talk about tailoring the communication strategy based on who you're dealing with.
Exactly. For instance, if you're dealing with someone who defaults to that strong competing style, like maybe our very determined marketing head in the budget scenario, you, as the leader trying to mediate, need to be very straightforward. Don't get defensive, don't get emotional in response to their forcefulness. You need to focus relentlessly on objective facts, hard data, and logical reasoning that connects directly back to that shared organizational goal you established. Clear boundaries and objective metrics are usually key for resolving issues with this style.
Okay, direct and data-driven for the competitor. What about the person who naturally leans towards the accommodating style? The one who might stay silent even when they strongly disagree, just to avoid rocking the boat.
With them, you need to actively draw them out. You have to consciously foster that safe environment we talked about, and then use targeted, maybe softer, open-ended questions to ensure they feel not just safe, but actually encouraged to voice their opinions and concerns. If you don't make that specific effort, you risk missing out on potentially vital information or perspectives they hold back.
So you might ask something like,
You might say, "Hey, Name, I noticed you haven't weighed in much on the proposed operations timeline. I value your perspective. What are your thoughts, or maybe any quiet concerns you have about the long-term sustainability of this approach?" Frame it as seeking their wisdom.
got it. Now, what about that tricky avoiding style? The person who maybe ducks the meeting altogether or sends a junior team member to deliver bad news or just goes silent when conflict arises?
Yeah, avoiders can be tough. You often need to approach them more gently, perhaps one-on-one initially, rather than putting them on the spot in a group setting. Frame the conversation not as a confrontation about the conflict, but as an opportunity for process improvement. They often avoid conflict because they genuinely believe confronting the issue will damage the relationship, or maybe they feel they lack the power to influence the outcome anyway.
So instead of forcing them to take a stand.
Instead of saying, "Why didn't you speak up?" Huh, try asking something future-focused and less personal, like, "Looking ahead, what are your thoughts on how we could potentially improve the budget allocation process next quarter to make it smoother for everyone?" This allows them to contribute valuable ideas on their own terms, focusing on structural or process improvements rather than assigning personal blame, which they dread.
Okay, tailoring the approach is key. Now, moving on, the sources really emphasize the importance of mediating conflicts neutrally. This sounds like it requires a pretty monumental shift in the leader's internal approach, especially if they have history with the people involved.
It really does. True neutrality means approaching every conflict without an inherent bias for one department over another, bias for one person's style over another's, or even bias towards a particular outcome before the discussion begins. The leader's absolute priority has to be the overall organizational welfare, and that must supersede any personal preferences or historical allegiances they might hold. But equally important, to ensure perceived fairness, they must rigorously guarantee that every voice involved is heard and valued equally during the process.
So, what are the concrete, practical steps a leader can take to maintain both actual and perceived neutrality, especially during a heated dispute?
Well, first, as we mentioned, they must clearly establish ground rules right at the onset, specifically banning personal attacks, ensuring respectful turn-taking, and maybe guaranteeing that sensitive data shared during the mediation remains confidential outside that specific resolution session. This creates a secure container for the difficult conversation.
Okay, rules first.
Second, for really intense or deep-rooted conflicts, think about a multi-year turf war between two senior VPs who just can't see eye to eye. The leader should seriously consider employing a neutral facilitator.
Bringing in an outsider, that seems like it could be a significant investment.
It can be, but it's often a critical one. An external facilitator brings objectivity. They lack the organizational history, the internal political baggage, the emotional attachments that the internal leader inevitably carries. They can often de-escalate heightened emotions and guide the discussion towards productive outcomes much more effectively, simply because they don't have skin in the internal game.
Makes sense.
And third, whether facilitating themselves or using an external helper, the leader must actively work to encourage empathy and understanding between the conflicting parties. This often involves prompting team members to genuinely try and consider the other party's perspective. Ask perspective-taking questions like, "Okay, marketing team, stepping into IT's shoes for a moment. What do you think their greatest fear is if they don't get this infrastructure funding?" Forcing that perspective shift can be powerful.
This all seems to boil down to the bedrock competency we keep coming back to, developing emotional intelligence, EQ, in leaders. If the leader can't effectively manage their own emotional triggers and responses under pressure, there's just no way they can successfully mediate conflicts involving others.
Absolutely fundamental. Active listening is a crucial toolkit here, yes. But the more advanced application of EQ in conflict involves diagnostics. Leaders need to become skilled at diagnosing in real time whether the conflict they're witnessing is primarily cognitive or affective.
Okay, break that down. What's the difference between cognitive and affective conflict?
Cognitive conflict is task-based disagreement. It's about the what or the how. We disagree on the best technical solution, or we have different opinions on the optimal budget allocation. This type of conflict, when managed well, is actually productive and healthy. It leads to better ideas.
Okay, disagreement about the work itself.
Right. Affective conflict, on the other hand, is emotional and personal. It's about the who. I feel marginalized and disrespected by the way you presented your IT risk assessment, or I don't trust your motives. This type of conflict is almost always toxic and destructive to team cohesion and performance. A leader with high EQ can sense when a cognitive disagreement is starting to slide into affective territory when it gets personal, and they can immediately intervene to pivot the conversation back from personal attacks or feelings towards a rational analysis of the task or the issue at hand.
That's a critical skill. So how does the leader effectively model the necessary behavior to keep the conflict cognitive and productive?
Several ways. First, by consciously acknowledging emotions expressed by others, but without necessarily agreeing with their viewpoint or interpretation. When the marketing head shows palpable frustration, the leader needs to recognize and affirm the feeling. I understand why this situation feels frustrating for you, given the ambitious targets we set together. That simple acknowledgement validates the person's human experience without ceding ground on the facts of the dispute. It often immediately diffuses some of the emotional charge.
Acknowledgement isn't agreement. Got it.
Second, the leader must consistently ask open-ended questions that invite deeper conversation and exploration, moving away from simple yes-no or accusatory questions. Instead of asking, did you meet the deadline or not, try asking something like, can you walk me through the main constraints that affected the project timeline, and perhaps how those constraints made the team feel along the way? This uncovers the underlying concerns, the context, the human impact, which individuals might be reluctant to state directly if asked a closed question.
Opens the door for more nuanced answers.
Exactly. And finally, perhaps the greatest ongoing test of a leader's EQ, modeling self-regulation.
Meaning keeping their own cool.
Precisely. If the leader allows their own frustration or impatience to show, maybe by raising their voice, sighing dramatically, interrupting constantly, using sarcasm, the team will inevitably mirror that behavior. A leader absolutely must manage their own responses, remain calm, composed, and maintain an attitude of intellectual curiosity, even during the most tense exchanges. By consistently setting that composed, respectful precedent, they effectively teach the team how to argue respectfully and productively by example.
Okay, so once we have leaders developing their EQ and learning to tailor their approach based on conflict styles, we need to make this a continuous, embedded practice throughout the organization, which means investing seriously in ongoing training and development for resolution.
Yes, this is absolutely non-negotiable if you want to build a conflict-competent culture. It really starts with regular training sessions that go beyond just one-off lectures or basic introductions. These programs need to cover more advanced communication strategies like nonviolent communication, practical emotional intelligence application, like diagnosing cognitive versus affective conflict, and maybe even formal negotiation skills. And the key is reinforcing that conflict resolution isn't a special skill for crises. It's a continuous organizational discipline, like financial management or project planning.
And the sources strongly recommend moving beyond theory with hands-on practice, specifically mentioning role-playing scenarios.
Yes, role-playing is incredibly valuable because it's essentially practice without penalty. By simulating realistic, high-stakes conflict scenarios, like a really hostile budget negotiation or mediating between two departments with conflicting priorities, team members get to actually practice applying tools like the 5 whys, or using tailored communication for an accommodating style versus a competing style. They can explore different approaches and outcomes in a safe, controlled environment. This builds crucial intellectual muscle memory and boosts their confidence for handling the real thing.
Builds the skills before the stakes are real. Makes sense. And finally, they mentioned a great collaborative mechanism, peer coaching.
Yeah, setting up a formal or even informal buddy system can be really effective. It allows leaders to discuss specific, tricky conflict situations they're facing and seek objective advice or just a sounding board from trusted colleagues who aren't personally involved in that particular dispute. This kind of collaborative approach often leads to more creative or nuanced solutions for difficult personnel issues. Plus, it helps strengthen internal relationships across the leadership cohort itself, fostering a culture where asking for help with conflict is seen as a sign of strength and collaborative spirit, not weakness.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. The sources of conflict, the benefits of resolving it well, and the essential strategies and skills leaders need to execute effectively. Now let's move into our final section, Section 5, where we talk about how to truly institutionalize this entire approach by establishing a formal framework, and ultimately how to leverage conflict as a catalyst for fundamental organizational progress and change.
Right. For constructive conflict resolution to become truly effective, predictable, and repeatable across an organization, leaders need to move beyond relying just on individual skill. They need to establish a conflict resolution framework. This framework needs to be a clearly communicated, ideally documented process that eliminates ambiguity about how we handle disagreements around here when tensions inevitably rise. It needs to become the organization's official playbook for dealing with conflict constructively.
Okay, so what are the foundational components that should be included in this kind of institutionalized framework?
Well, you'd want to start by proactively defining common conflict scenarios. Try to identify the typical flashpoints that regularly occur in your specific organization. Maybe it's chronic miscommunication between sales and operations, maybe it's role ambiguities during project handoffs, maybe it's those perennial competing resource demands. Give these common scenarios names so leaders can recognize them early and address them proactively using the framework, hopefully before they escalate into major blowups.
So anticipate the likely friction points. And then, again, we need to stress the importance of establishing ground rules within that framework. They seem to be the bedrock of perceived fairness.
Absolutely critical. The framework must explicitly stipulate the ground rules for engagement. Things like respectful communication, a commitment to active listening, and perhaps very specific rules like the no interruption rule during the initial clarification phase of a mediation. These rules shouldn't just be written down somewhere. They need to be visible, maybe posted in meeting rooms, and explicitly referenced by the leader or facilitator at the start of any potentially tense meeting.
Okay, common scenarios identified, ground rule set. And then the framework needs that clear step-by-step resolution process we touched on earlier. Our sources outlined 5 critical steps. Let's really flesh out what happens in each step within this formal framework.
Yes, this clarity is what keeps the process grounded and moving forward when emotions might be running high. The 5 steps are: 1. Identification. This is simply recognizing and acknowledging formally that a conflict exists and needs attention through the framework. It involves naming it neutrally. For example, okay team, we are officially identifying that we're experiencing a resource allocation conflict between the risk mitigation focus of IT and the growth mandate of marketing. We will now use our established framework to address this.
Step 1, name it.
Clarification. This is the crucial seek first to understand step formalized. It involves allowing each party involved to fully express their perspective, their underlying needs and interests, their feelings about the situation, and their desired outcome completely uninterrupted. The leader or facilitator here uses active listening techniques like mirroring and paraphrasing. Okay, thank you. So what I think I heard you saying, IT Director, is that your primary concern is the potential $5 million regulatory fine, which makes this router upgrade feel extremely urgent and non-negotiable from your perspective. Is that accurate?
Step 2, uninterrupted clarification and validation.
3. Discussion. This is the analytical engine of the framework. Engaging in open, structured dialogue to understand the root causes of the conflict, not just the surface positions. This is where tools like the 5 whys or maybe mapping out shared interests versus conflicting interests come into play. The discussion must be relentlessly focused on understanding the shared impact of the problem and exploring potential mutual dependencies or areas for trade-offs.
Step 3, analyze root causes collaboratively.
4. Resolution. This is where the parties work towards agreeing on a mutually acceptable solution or path forward. Now, this might involve true collaboration, finding an innovative win-win hybrid solution. It might involve compromise, like splitting the budget with a clear, documented commitment to revisit. Or in some cases, it might even involve a structured form of competition, where the leader has to make the tough final decision based on pre-agreed, transparent criteria if consensus can't be reached. The key is that the outcome is explicit and agreed upon.
Step 4, agree on the solution or decision.
5. Follow-up. This is perhaps the most critical step for building long-term trust, and ironically, it's the one most often missed in practice. The framework must include a scheduled check-in after the resolution has been implemented, maybe weeks or even months later. This follow-up is essential to ensure the agreed-upon solution is actually working, to hold everyone accountable for their commitments made during the resolution phase, and critically, to learn from the experience and potentially adjust processes to prevent recurrence of similar conflicts in the future.
Okay, identification, clarification, discussion, resolution, and that crucial follow-up. If that framework is successfully implemented and consistently used, conflict really does shift from being a crisis to manage, doesn't it? It becomes more like a predictable, structured mechanism for driving organizational progress.
That's the goal.
So let's finish by talking about that ultimate objective,
Yeah.
truly leveraging conflict as a change catalyst.
Exactly. Instead of dreading conflict, leaders should learn to embrace it as a valuable signal. It's an opportunity to reassess potentially outdated dynamics, misaligned priorities, or inefficient communication structures within the organization. When managed effectively through a robust framework like the one we described, conflict stops being a problem and starts serving as a powerful engine for systemic learning and growth.
Okay, how exactly does navigating conflict well through this kind of process actually drive positive, lasting change throughout the system? What are the mechanisms?
Well, there are several ways. First, as we discussed, it drives change by encouraging innovation. That inherent tension that comes from diverse opinions, when channeled constructively through a collaborative framework, genuinely generates more creative, robust solutions than any single department or homogeneous group could likely devise on its own. Conflict becomes a source of new ideas.
Okay, innovation through managed friction.
Second, it works by strengthening team bonds. This is the relational payoff. When individuals and teams successfully navigate and work through intense differences, like maybe the operations head genuinely accepts a reduced cost-cutting target for a quarter so marketing can launch a strategically vital campaign, they develop a much deeper, more resilient understanding of each other's pressures and perspectives. It builds genuine camaraderie. They realize, wow, we can disagree really intensely on something important and still function effectively together as a unified, high-performing team. That's powerful.
Third, and this might be particularly valuable for the leader personally, it involves building trust through vulnerability.
Yes. When leaders openly address conflicts using the framework, when they're willing to share their decision criteria transparently, even if the decision is unpopular, they demonstrate authenticity. That perceived vulnerability from the leader actually encourages others on the team to feel safer, sharing their own honest thoughts, concerns, and even feelings. It helps foster an environment where team members start seeing each other less as adversaries in a constant budget fight and more as allies committed to the same ultimate success, even if they approach it differently.
Vulnerability breeds trust.
It really can. Fourth, there's the immediate, tangible benefit of enhancing communication skills across the board. Simply engaging regularly in structured conflict resolution using the framework requires everyone involved to sharpen their articulation skills, learning how to summarize complex risk assessments clearly, for instance. It forces practice in advanced active listening. These crucial dialogue techniques get honed under the pressure of real stakes, ensuring that all future discussions, even routine non-conflict ones, tend to become more efficient and productive.
Practice makes perfect, or at least better. And the cumulative effect of all this, the innovation, the stronger bonds, the trust, the better communication, leads to the final high-level change, creating a culture of respect.
Exactly. By consistently modeling healthy, mature, and rigorous conflict resolution through the established framework, the leadership team sets an incredibly powerful precedent for the entire organization. Over time, this cultivates a culture where different opinions aren't just tolerated, they are genuinely valued as necessary counterweights and sources of insight. Disagreements are approached analytically and constructively as opportunities for improvement, rather than defensively or personally as threats to be quashed.
Wow. This has been a truly deep dive into not just managing conflict, but actually mastering it, reframing it. The core message seems crystal clear. Disagreements aren't just inevitable. They're an essential, natural, and recurring part of working with talented, passionate, engaged people. And the most effective leaders. They understand that conflict isn't a setback or a sign of failure. It is arguably the most valuable opportunity they have to foster robust collaboration, fuel real innovation, and ultimately achieve superior collective success for the organization.
Well said. By actively engaging with team members during disputes, by leveraging simple but powerful tools like the 5 whys or understanding conflict styles, and by constantly shifting the conversation away from narrow personal or departmental needs towards those broader, superordinate goals, leaders can uncover the true underlying issues driving the conflict. They facilitate genuinely open dialogue and cultivate an environment of deep professional trust. And that not only solves the immediate problem more effectively, but it fundamentally enriches the team dynamic and strengthens the organization for the long haul.
We spent a good amount of time discussing that 5-step framework for conflict resolution: identification, clarification, discussion, resolution, and that really crucial but often overlooked final step: follow-up.
The follow-up is key.
And if managing conflict effectively is truly about building and, importantly, maintaining trust and accountability throughout the organization, not just achieving temporary compliance or smoothing things over for now, then that follow-up step feels like where the organizational rubber really meets the road, doesn't it?
It absolutely is.
Okay.
It's the step that proves the integrity and the seriousness of the initial resolution process. Without it, resolutions can just fade away.
So, as you, our listener, reflect on this deep dive and maybe consider your own leadership practices or your team's dynamics, here's a provocative final thought for you to mull over. If accountability is really about sustained commitment to an agreed action, and trust is the bedrock belief that the system and its processes are fair and have integrity, how does truly institutionalizing that follow-up step Actually scheduling and holding those check-ins weeks or months after, say, the IT upgrade is installed and the partial marketing campaign has run its course, how does that fundamentally change the perceived accountability of your entire resolution process?
And perhaps even more importantly, what specific tangible message does that regular documented check-in communicate to your team about the value you place on their contributions, their concerns, and the lasting integrity of your leadership decisions long after the heat of the initial conflict has subsided?
Something to think about.